Mhm. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is our second special genealogy presentation for Women's History Month, presented by the Pueblo City County Library District and their local history and genealogy department. I have our special guest from California, Gina Filibert Ortega, and she's going to talk to us today about documenting women's relationships. So, Gina, tell us a bit about what we can expect today.
So, what we're going to do is a lot of times, the problem is we think that we can't find female ancestors. And we have to kind of look at it differently than when we research men. And so, one of the ways is by looking at their relationship. So, that's what we're going to do today. All right.
Exactly, and what you said is perfectly true. So many patrons tell me how difficult it is to find
Mhm.
information. So any tip, any secret documents would be so helpful. So thank you so much for being with us today, and we will get started.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining us today. So let's get started and let's start with an overall methodology for researching female ancestors. There's actually 5 things that you need to keep in mind when you're researching your female ancestors. And number one is obvious. You want to research her, right? So you do that by going online, by putting in a name, a date, a place, using ancestry and family search. But sometimes you might kind of hit a brick wall at that point because women historically aren't as well documented. So then you want to look at her relationships. Okay. And so that can be with her, her father, her brothers, whatever birth family she has. And then you might want to look at researching her family. If she had a family, if she married, if she had children, you might want to look at researching them. You don't want to make the mistake of just researching your direct line. You want to look at the whole family because sometimes siblings, for example, leave better records than the individual themselves. Then you want to look at her fan club. So, what does that mean? That is her friends, associates, and neighbors. The fact of the matter is, prior to now, uh, women are represented in the groups they belong to, in the clubs they belong to, in the people they interacted with. Their neighbors, their friends wrote letters and diaries. They went to organizational meetings, and those are where we find instances of women being mentioned, but they're not found by just typing in a name, date, and place. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, you want to consider the era, the time period that she lived in. Now, why does that matter? Well, depending on the time period, that directly relates to what records exist. There are certain records that exist in certain time periods. And so, if you know what's going on historically and what's going on in the place that you're researching, you're going to have better luck. So ask yourself as you're researching, as you're creating a timeline or research log for her life, what activities lead to records? Now, birth, marriage, death, that leads to records, right? But there's other things that can lead to records as well. So, church attendance, for example, or being involved in some kind of organization. So, you want to take note of that and start looking for those records. And keep in mind as we think about what activities lead to what records, once again, it matters on time and location. So if you're getting married during a specific time period, you would look for a marriage license. And then if they actually got married, because you can get a marriage license and then not get married, you would look for a marriage certificate. Now, that isn't true depending on what time period it is. So early on in America, you might be looking at a marriage ban or a marriage bond, for example. So once again, you need to know the time period and the place. And I'll tell you just right off the bat before we continue, I would highly suggest that you look at the Family Search Research Wiki and do a search on the place, and that tells you about the records. Now, when we're researching women, we also want to consider, if she's married, what was the man in her life? What are they involved in? Because sometimes that leads us to records about her. So, for example, if he's a Mason, she might have been involved in one of the female auxiliaries. If he had fought in the Civil War and he was in the Union side, he might have been a member of the fraternal order after the Civil War called the Grand Army of the Republic. She might have been a member of the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic or the Women's Relief Corps. So we want to consider, what's he involved in and what leads to records for the women in his life. So we want to look at occupations, and remember, women have always worked. Okay, so maybe even an occupation for her. We want to look at memberships, whether that's through a family member or through herself. And that could be a benevolent group, that could be a political group, that could be a fraternal or a lineage group. And then we also want to consider religion when we research women. What church did they go to, and what records did that church have? Not all churches have records, and sometimes, depending on the religion, there might be some kind of female auxiliaries that have records as well. So we want to consider all of that. Okay, so let's start with looking at relationships, and let's start with wives and widows. And I'm putting that together because obviously wives may end up being widows. And so some of these records are going to help you either way. So let's talk about marriage in particular and getting married and what records exist. Now, as I mentioned before, depending on the time period and the place, there can be all kinds of records that exist. And so you really need to read what is the time and place. But let's say we're researching California and we're looking at the 20th century. Well, California had these marriage license / certificates. And so the top part gives us information about the couple, including their names, their ages, how many times they've been married, their race, and their parents. And then at the bottom, it lists who married them and what the date of the marriage, because, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, just because you got a marriage license, you may not have been married, and you may have had to do a waiting period. So we'll talk about that in a second. Now, like I said, there's going to be different kinds of marriage records. Some of them are going to be official, like this one, which is from the County of Los Angeles. And then some of them are not official, like this lovely certificate that is framed. It was actually professionally framed. It was filled out by probably the minister. It might be a certificate that he carried with him. And it's something the couple would have had in their home hanging up, but it is not official certificate. So if you have something like this that's decorative, you would want to look for the official from whatever the county or the parish and the state. So keep that in mind. And there might be more than one marriage record, especially if the person getting married is underage. That's one instance where there would be some kind of parental consent. So let's talk a little bit about marriage before we go on. And let's talk about some of the considerations when we're thinking about documenting marriage. So I mentioned that you might get a marriage license and you might not get married for several days after that, or even weeks. Now, why is that? Some states, depending on the time period, had a waiting period. And sometimes, especially in the 20th century, the early 20th century to about World War II, this is called a gin marriage law. So that probably tells you something just from the word gin, right? It was a law that some states put into place because they believed that if there was a cooling off period between getting the marriage license and actually getting married, that some couples who were destined for divorce later in life would not get married. And so they were concerned about divorce rates. They thought that this would help the divorce rate, is if there was this cooling off period. Now, during wartime, what happens? Men go off to war. You start contemplating what could happen to you, and couples hurry and get married. Well, in California, for example, during World War II, there was a gin marriage law. And so what happened was, instead of waiting the 3 days, couples would go to Yuma, Arizona, and they would get married there because there was no waiting period. And so that's something that would happen. And so if you have a family who you can't figure out where are they married, it might be that they ran off to get married somewhere else where the laws were different. Now, another way to think of this is something called a Gretna Green. Now, a Gretna Green is named for a place in Scotland called Gretna Green, and it's a place that couples run off to get married. And that's different for every state. So in California and neighboring states, that is Vegas, right? People run off to Vegas to get married because you go and within an hour or so you can be married. You don't have to, wait. You don't have to take any blood tests. If that's required in your state, you can just run off and get married. So that's what a Gretna Green is. And that might be in your own state. There might be different counties where it's easier to get married, or it might mean traveling to a different state, or even Mexico would be a Gretna Green for some people in the United States. So that's something that could have happened with your ancestors as well, making it difficult for you to find where they were married. Now, age of consent is something that we have to deal with when we're thinking about marriage records. And if there was someone who was underage who was getting married, then they would have had to have a parent or a guardian sign. And typically, those records are with the marriage license or the marriage certificate. It should be in the page before, so if it's still extant. Now, age of consent has been different throughout time, throughout the United States. Each state has its own age of consent. Sometimes, historically, women's age of consent is lower than men's because it was considered that men would have to support their family. So you do see age of consent for women in the low teenagers because that was allowed, and or that they could get married with parental consent. Now, sometimes they would have had to have proof of age. That might be something with the marriage record. Now, sometimes we find ancestors that seem to be married and then they're marrying someone else, or they're running off and it appears they're married, but where's the divorce? Historically, in the United States, we've had polygamy, most notably through the Mormon Church, but that stopped in the early 1900s. So, what happens then? Well, it isn't unheard of for people to run off and kind of leave their families behind and get remarried without benefit of divorce. Think about what it was like prior to cell phones and mass communication. You could run off and get married and be in the next county over and nobody would know the difference. So you could have a few families going. So sometimes, although if somebody disappears, we'd want to look at a death certificate or maybe a divorce record, it is possible that they could have remarried without benefit of that. Now, one website you might be interested in as you want to find marriage records is this index. It's of links to various marriage records and birth records by state and then by county if possible. It is called Online Birth and Marriage Record Indexes for the USA. I'll tell you, there's also death indexes for the USA, which is also a wonderful site. And this tells you if there's a payment involved or if it's a free database. Some of these databases are on Ancestry and Family Search, but not all of them. So let's talk about Ancestry for a second. Now, you're probably used to going on Ancestry and searching on name, date, and place. They just moved the search engine over to that right-hand side. So I want to teach you a different way to search on Ancestry. So go up to the top where that black toolbar is and click on Search. There's going to be a drop-down menu. At the top, it's going to say All Collections. So click on that. And you're going to come to this page. So this is kind of an advanced search page. As you see at the very bottom, there is a map. And this map changes depending on, if you click on Europe or USA or whatever. The for those who are doing library edition or have a US subscription, the default is USA. So you can click on the state. So let's say Colorado, and then you can see what records they have for that state. This is a good way to search because not everything on Ancestry is indexed, and some of it's only browsable. Okay, so here it is. And I'll tell you, when you click on the state, it's going to show you a blow up of the map and some of the databases. But if there's a little blue button to look at all the databases, you'll get to this page. Now, do you see how we're on the Colorado collections page and I have an arrow pointing to birth, marriage, and death? So these are all the databases that have to do with Colorado birth, marriage, and death. And if I click on view all Colorado birth, marriage, and death, that expands this list even more. Okay, so there it is. I've highlighted some of the databases that are specific to Colorado that have to do with marriage. And you can see the first one is Select County Marriages 1863 to 2018. And then we have County Marriage and State Index. We have a Divorce Index. And then we have a Statewide Marriage Index. So I can click on any one of those and then search from that database, which actually is a good idea, because if you select the specific database you want, you will get the search engine for that database, and you can also browse the collection. So I highly recommend, if you can't find something, to do it that way. So here's an example. This is Colorado County Marriage Records and State Index. So this is the search engine for that index, okay? And you can see we have the search engine box here, and we've got name, marriage date, and place. We've got a place for the spouse. We've got a keyword. We've got a film number. I would ignore that if I were you, and then gender. So the more you put into a search engine database, the fewer results you're going to get, which makes sense. So you probably only want to put maybe a surname, both surnames, for example, or maybe a place and a surname. Now, if you want, you could, over on the right, browse the collection. This will help you determine if they even have what you need. They may not. This may not be every county in Colorado, and it may not be 1862 to 2006. It might just be a few of those years. So by browsing, that might help. Now, the last thing I want you to pay attention to is, do you see at the bottom of the screen, it says source information? And I'm going to blow this up in a second. And then below that, it says about. So the source information says it gives you the name of the Ancestry database. We already know that. We're on that page. But it says the original data is from Marriage Records, Colorado Marriages, State Archives, Denver, Colorado. Okay. So that tells me this information is from the State Archives. Okay. Then you can decide how good that would be. But keep in mind, this is an index, and you can see it says this collection consists of marriage records from various counties. Okay, so that's not all of them, right? So now we know it's not every county. So that's why browsing is a good idea. And then it tells you a little bit, and it says it has the name, the age at marriage, the marriage date, the marriage place, and the parents' names. Okay. An index doesn't include everything from a record. So once we find it in here, we would want to either go to the archives, contact the archives or the county and get the actual record itself. Okay. Because this isn't going to tell me everything. Now, another place that you might find marriage information beyond just Ancestry or Family Search, obviously you're going to find it on the county or state level, but another place you might look if you don't know where they were married is you might look at Percy. Now, Percy is the periodical source index, and it is from Allen County Public Library. It's also called the Genealogy Center. Now, if you've been doing genealogy for a long time, you know that the Percy was on Ancestry, it was on Find My Past, but it's basically now back at ACPL. It is free, so you want to use this database. Now, why I'm suggesting this is because sometimes what happens is genealogy societies, they do indexes and transcriptions, and then they publish these in their journals or their newsletters. And that's what gets indexed in Percy. So you can search by surname. However, I would suggest you search by place or a keyword. So you can search on Colorado, for example, and you'll get all the subjects that have to do with Colorado. So here's an example. I did Colorado, and then I just I did a keyword search for marriage, and I got 2 articles. So not very many. I would expect to see more than that, but that's okay. So you can see the bottom one is a marriage index of Cornish names from 1864 to 1944. That's a unique index, and it's something that you would find on Percy, and that's the benefit of using Percy. Now, once you find what you're interested in, there is a form on the Genealogy Center's website where you can note the article's title, what the journal's name is, what page, what year, all this information. You send $7.50, I believe, $7.50. They will pull the article, copy it, and then charge you a per copy fee. It's fairly inexpensive. And then you can get those copies delivered to your house where you can go through them. The information is not online, so the article isn't online, but you'd have to have them copy it or you'd have to find it some other way. All right. When we think about marriages, and actually any topic that we're discussing today, we also want to think of archival sources. Now, you may not have archival experience researching. Archives are like libraries, but they have items we typically refer to as manuscript collections. And these are items that are not published. They are done by people involved in the event at the time of the event. So this might be correspondence, so letters and postcards, journals and diaries, yearbooks, which are published, but they may have those, photographs. They may even have cuttings from newspapers, for example, and membership records. So why we want this is, remember that fan club, the FAN? Well, people in our ancestors' neighborhood wrote about them, and they wrote about events. And this is a way to find that information, but you can't search by your ancestor's name. Instead, you're going to search by the place that they lived. Okay. So, for example, you would want to search for the city and the state or the county and the state and see what records exist. These are cataloged by place and sometimes by the type of item it is or the person whose item it was. It is not indexed by everyone mentioned. So that's why you're not going to search by your ancestor's name. Instead, you're going to search by place. Now, Archive Grid is a archival catalog for the world. And so what you're going to do, but not everybody participates, you're going up at that top box, you're going to search by place, for example. And then you're going to click on search. Now, 7 million records worldwide, not everybody participates. So this means that you do this search, but you also search archives that are local to where your family is from. So just to see what would happen, I did love letters, and there were over 14,000. And you can see that there's different collections of love letters. So really, there's anything that you can think of, but always start the search by a place and then narrow it down from there. Now, one of the things to keep in mind throughout this time together is you always want to be searching newspapers, because newspapers talk about marriage, they talk about love, they talk about widowhood, they mention spinsters. They do all of that. And so we always want to be researching in newspapers. Now, we'll look at another newspaper site in a second, but let me just tell you something about Library of Congress Chronicling America. This is a free site from Library of Congress, U.S. newspapers, and it's basically where libraries uploaded digitized newspapers. Now, that's great. However, there's another function on Chronicling America. Over on that pink button that says U.S. Newspaper Directory 1690 to present, if you click on that, that is a way you can search by title, by place, by type of newspaper, and see what exists for where your ancestor lived. Now, it's not a comprehensive list. It's not every newspaper that ever existed, but it's a nice list, especially if the newspaper you need is not on a digitized newspaper website. And there's lots of reasons why. Money is a factor. Not all of them have survived. Sometimes they are just bound in a library somewhere and that's it, or they're on microfilm and they haven't been digitized. So once you click that button, you get this directory. And so, like I said, you can browse by title. You could browse by or search by a state and a county. You could enter a keyword. Because there are different types of newspapers, including, for example, Spanish language newspapers that were published in the US or Irish newspapers that were published in the US. So you could try that as well. If you're researching a woman who's part of an immigrant community, like maybe they immigrated from Mexico or from Ireland or from Germany, they might be in a local ethnic or foreign language newspaper, especially if they're in a bigger city, for example. So those are important to check out. So all kinds of information is printed in the newspaper. It used to be you couldn't do anything without it appearing in the newspaper. Like this one that talks about a youthful couple that eloped, but they didn't have any ceremony. And so there might be some shenanigans going on there. So that's a good example of what might be out there. But you can see this is from the Wyoming State Tribune. And the couple they went to Wichita, Kansas. So you have to sometimes narrow your search by where they lived or open it up because it might be part of a story that might have larger implications. And especially if they ran off to get married or they went to a Gretna Green, you would want to expand your search to other states. Okay, let's talk about family search. And you're going to always want to use family search. In fact, you probably should use it the first thing you do when you research. So here's family search. If you click on search at the very top, you can then click on catalog. And what I always recommend that you do is you search by the place. So the county and the state. Now, if you're researching a place like New England where they have town records, then you're going to want to search by town, county, state. So it matters where you're searching. Once you do that, you're going to get all the subjects that Family Search has records in. Some of those are going to be digitized. And so you can look at them. Some of them won't be. You'll have to go to the Family History Library. But it's a way for you to see what's available. Now, I said we talk a little bit about widows, and so this is where I'm going to jump in and talk about widows. So, women, when they're married, they're in a lot of records that have to do with their husbands. What happens when they are no longer married? Well, sometimes they remarry, right? And it makes it difficult because they changed their surname and we don't know what happened to them. But something that happens in the early 1900s is something called mother's pensions. Now, this is a precursor to welfare, as you probably know about it today. And this allowed women who were widowed or whose husbands left them to get money to help them support their children. And so this wasn't for every state, but here's an example where I went to the catalog and I actually didn't search by place. I searched by keyword and I put in mother's pensions. And you can see sometimes it's mothers with an apostrophe S, sometimes it's mothers with an S and apostrophe. But lucky for me, it found it either way. And so here's different examples of mothers' pensions that exist and the records that exist. This, once again, is part of knowing the place and the time period and what records exist. All right, since we talked about marriage, let's talk about divorce because that leads to records as well. And I know a lot of people think they didn't divorce in the good old days. They most certainly did. People have always got divorced, or they just left their spouse and didn't get divorced and just started a new life. It might have been more difficult at certain time periods, and maybe not. It once again matters on time and place. So, what happens if you're married and you don't want to be married anymore? Well, you may commit bigamy where you just kind of walk away. You might be in a state where it's very difficult or expensive to get a divorce. So you just one day go out for milk, you never come back. So that might happen. You might have someone called a grass widow. So I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but a grass widow is anybody whose husband just isn't around. Now, there can be really legit reasons for this. Maybe her husband is in the military and he's doing a year tour somewhere. And so he's gone. Or her husband is a whale fisherman in the 1800s and he's gone for a year at a time. She would be considered a grass widow. So you might see her in records by herself. Now, you might just have a mistress instead, and we'll talk about mistresses in a little bit. So, there's all kinds of things that can happen within marriage that leads to divorce or that should lead to divorce. So, remember when we were on Ancestry and we clicked on search and then we clicked on birth, marriage, and death? So, here's our list again. And remember, we had a divorce index. Now, once again, this isn't every divorce, and it's probably certain counties. If I was looking for divorce papers, I need to go to the courthouse. But you can see it says they have divorce index 1851 to 1985. There's 711,000 records. Once again, that might not be everybody though. And that is an index. It's not the actual records. If your ancestor got divorced, you definitely want to see the actual records. Now, courthouse records are important, whether it's a divorce or not. And so sometimes we can find women in those courthouse records, even if it's a time period where women did not have legal rights. So we're looking at about 1850 and prior, some states after 1850. People would have had to sue their husbands, for example, because women didn't have a right to anything. But we still want to go to the courthouse. She may have been in someone's will, like her father or her mother, her husband. So even if it's not a divorce record, courthouse records are good. So just because it's a courthouse record doesn't mean it's necessarily at the courthouse. So you need to identify where those records are. Is it at a courthouse? Is it at a county archive? Is it at a courthouse archive where they have to go and they have to, it's in storage and they have to go access it? Is it on Family Search? They do have some court records, as does Ancestry, or some other subscription website. You might have to determine access. What's the cost going to be? Here in California, if I want a divorce record, even if it's from the 1800s, I have to pay a search fee. And then once they find it, I have to pay a fee for the file. So you want to determine cost. Then, is it accessible by microfilm? Something that you could do. And then you might need to research the law about when was divorce acceptable, under what circumstances. You might want to go into all of that so you can determine what kind of records might exist. And obviously, depending on the time period, there are going to be records that look different. So on the left, we have a divorce from 1850 in Texas or 1856. On the right, we have one from 1946 in Nebraska. So it's typed. So they're going to look different depending on the time period. And they're going to have different types of items with it depending on the time period. Now, once again, let's talk newspapers. Now, It used to be if you were divorcing, you might be in the newspaper in a few different areas. You might be in the legal notices in the back, especially if the spouse couldn't find you. You might be in a section about what's going on in court cases. This is one from the late 1800s from Wisconsin that says that Judge Bennett has granted a divorce in the case of Ella G. Stetson against John C. Stetson on the ground of desertion. And the parties are well known in Milton. So, small town, you might get little notices about stuff like this. And then you'd want to go and look for the actual record. Here's an example from Georgia where they listed every divorce case they were hearing that Saturday. And that's from 1922. Sometimes it might be the legal notices. And like I said, especially if you couldn't find the spouse and you needed to serve them, you might get something in the legal notices. So newspapers are always good to not just look for, some big article about your ancestor, but to look in those legal notices. And then sometimes, and you may have seen these, there might be a special notice. In this case, this actually isn't someone related to me, but you can see at the bottom it says, "My wife, Eva Philibert, has left her home and I will not be responsible for any debts by her." Now, this kind of thing started in colonial America because women who were married did not have legal rights and their husbands were responsible for everything. So they would put notices in the newspaper. We call these runaway wife ads. So this extends into the 1900s. I think the men thought that that might absolve them of anything, but it didn't normally do that. Now, remember, if we're looking at a marriage record, we want to carefully analyze it. So you see on this one that we looked at before, it says, what's the number of marriage? The first. Okay, so supposedly they've never been married before. In this case, I know that the guy was married before. Obviously, they're the informant. They could lie, but that might be a clue to a previous marriage. As well as a birth certificate for a woman's children might be a clue to a previous marriage. It used to be that birth certificates might say how many children that woman has had. So you can see where my arrow is. It says that she had 3 that were born alive and now living, 2 who were born alive but now dead, and it looks like 1, oh no, I'm sorry, that's not it. Number of children for this mother is 3. 2 were born alive and now living, and 1 was born alive but now dead. Now, if she had only been married a short time, then you would know she either had a relationship or she was married previously, so you might want to look. So you might want to carefully analyze that information when you think about her marriage to her current husband. And obviously, I know this is a big shock. People didn't have to be married to have children. Okay, now let's go into mistresses. What happens when an ancestor has a mistress? What records are left behind? Now, you may think nothing, unless somebody wrote it in their diary or something. Well, maybe. Actually, there could be criminal charges. There could be adultery, seduction, and fornication. So, having a mistress and getting caught might land you in jail. In fact, Frank Sinatra had that situation when he was a younger man. So that might happen. It could lead to divorce, obviously. It could lead to bigamy. So you could run off and start a new family. It could lead to the mistress getting pregnant. It could lead to assault. It could lead to a husband who is all of a sudden missing, or nothing happens. So let me give you an example of what could happen. So this is from the 1800s, and this was in a few states, not all states, where they had something called a bastardy bond. So what is that? Well, if you were a woman who had a child out of wedlock, uh, the local area didn't want to support that kid. So somebody had to step forward. And so, unfortunately, what would happen a lot of times is the midwife who would help deliver the woman of the child would, when things got really painful, refuse to help until you named the father of the child. So they sometimes got midwives involved. And what could also happen is you would be taken to court and you would be asked to name the father of the child. And if you didn't, they might even make your father responsible. And they would have to submit a bond that basically was guaranteeing that they would, either the father of the child or the father of the woman, that they would take care financially of this child. Now, here's an example of bastardy bonds that North Carolina Digital Collection has uploaded, and it's basically kind of a transcription. It's not the original bond. You can also find these on Family Search by doing a place search or by doing a keyword search for bastardy bond. And you can see there's North Carolina, there's some from England, so they're in different places. Just because they're not on Family Search doesn't mean they don't exist, though. And like I said before, if you don't know enough about that place and what records exist over time, do a search. So for example, Colorado genealogy, and that will give you the various record types, and it will also lead you to records. Now, is it everything? No, but it's a great place to start your search. Okay, so if we have a mistress, what kind of newspaper articles would we expect? Well, we would especially expect to see newspaper articles that have to do with the crime of adultery, fornication, as you see here. And so that might be something that you find in the newspaper. And obviously, if you uh, do a search on your ancestor's name, you might find it and find the name of the person that they were accused of being with. Now, sometimes, and I'm not saying it's this time, but sometimes in personal notices, you might see ads called missing husband ads. These were prevalent in the early 1900s. I have an arrow going to two. Actually, one of these guys was murdered, so that's why he was missing. But I don't know about the other one. And so, there's no way to track where your husband went. You would put it in the newspaper and describe what he was wearing and what he was supposed to be doing, and then hope that someone saw it and could contact you. Now, in the case, let me go back. In the case of that man at the bottom, he actually he disappeared. His wife put in an ad several times in the Dallas Daily Morning News, and she even went to his union, the leather workers. He was a saddle maker, and put an ad in there saying that she would give a $50 reward for information. And then what happened was, as I followed that on Google Books, I found out that he had been murdered, and that's why he was missing. Now, sometimes communities took it upon themselves to do something about men leaving or having mistresses. This is one of the things that happened in the Jewish community. Is they had a national desertion board where in the newspaper, you can see this is a Jewish newspaper, they published the picture of the guy and his information and asked people if they saw him to turn him in. That was one way the community dealt with it. They wanted to be seen not as model immigrants, but also they wanted to take care of it on their own terms. Now, these newspapers exist, and then in a archive called the YIVO Archives, they have the records of that National Desertion Bureau. So 20,000 files. So there you go. You never know what records could exist. So lastly, let's talk about spinsters. And what are spinsters? They're women who've never married or hadn't married to a certain time. Sometimes women who are 23 were considered spinsters, depending on the time period. So what do women who aren't married leave behind? And there's lots of reasons to choose not to marry historically. So don't assume that all women got married. Some of them had to take care of family members. Some of them just never got the chance. Some of them didn't want to get married. So when we do that kind of research, we want to look at archival collections. We're looking for letters, we're looking for membership organizations, any kind of record like that. We're looking at her fan club once again, and we want to look at newspapers. Okay. So once again, it matters time and place. So let's talk a little bit about newspapers in this case. So I showed you Chronicling America. We've talked about newspapers up to now. Let's talk a little bit about newspapers.com, but really any subscription newspaper website. Now, it's easy to go put in a name, search, and then say, they're not there, and move on with your life. But you need to do two things first. The first thing you need to do is go up at the top and you see it says newspapers.com. It says search and then papers. Click on papers and then do a search of the newspapers. Because they may not have the newspaper you need. So you can go to this, you can click on or type in the state that you're interested in, and then you can search by title or by the city. Then what you need to do is see how these little thumbnail, they show the newspaper, they tell the title, they say what the place is, and then they say what the year range is. So if you look at the very top, there's one from Omaha, Nebraska, that's 3N, that says 1946, and it's 6 pages. So does that mean it's all of 1946? Of course not. It's probably one issue, maybe 6 at best. So what you need to do is you need to click on it and then see what it says for the time range. Because even if it shows 1940 to 1951, that doesn't mean January to December. It might only mean a few days. So you need to keep that in mind. The other thing you need to keep in mind is how do you search? Now, women are in all kinds of articles, even spinsters. In fact, here's a fun one from basically the society pages. Sometimes they're also the women's pages. And it's about the Spinsters Club, which was a kind of a fun little club for younger women to be a member of until they got married. So what we want to do is we want to think about what was she a member of and search by those groups, because sometimes newspaper articles that have to do with her may not have her name, but might have what the group is doing. And then we want to think about name variations for her. So if she's not married, what's her name variations? Let's say her name is Margaret Smith. What's a nickname historically for Margaret? Peggy. That makes no sense today, but that is what the historical nickname for Margaret is. But it could be, maybe Maggie, maybe Marge, maybe, some other variation. So I'd want to write that down and search by that. And then I might want to search by initials or even, unfortunately, Miss Smith. So I want to search by all of those. Now, if she was married, I'd want to search by his name, because historically women have been known as Mrs. whatever his name is and all his name variations. That's how you do a good exhaustive newspaper search. Remember that we're looking for newspapers because we want to find mention of our ancestor, but we also want to see what were they doing? What were they involved in? And sometimes those articles don't have her name. So as we wrap up, how do you research women in relation to their relationships? You got to know the time period. What's going on in that time period? That tells you what records exist or don't exist. You need to think about history and stay away from myths about history. Oh, no one ever got divorced. Everyone got married. That's all nonsense. So don't buy into that, because what that does is it stops you from doing good research. Identify what resources exist for the time and place she lived. Use newspapers and use them exhaustively. Just because you have one subscription site doesn't mean you stop there. In fact, the newspaper might not be digitized. Use name variations, whether it's a newspaper or something else. Write down all the different ways her name could be and all the misspellings. And then keep a research log so you know where you've researched, what you found, and also what you didn't find. That can help you as you're researching. All right. Do we have any questions?
Sorry, I was on mute. So do we have any questions for Gina? I can tell you, you've got one like from Kala Seppi Breads. Thank you, Kala Seppi Breads. Um, do we have any questions? Mhm. Okay. Thank you. That was very informative. There were so many places. Just when you think you've seen everything and know everything on Library of Congress and Family Search, you realize you don't. That there's still one corner you haven't looked at. But my goodness,
Absolutely. And can I also
wow.
say, Giselle, I mean, you know this as a librarian, there's a real benefit to going to Family Search and just searching on the catalog for the place
Yeah.
and looking through, clicking on every subject and seeing what you can find because sometimes there's records you had no idea ever existed.
Yeah, the bastardy bonds, that's a new one. I did not know about that. And these ads for missing husbands, it shouldn't be a surprise to me, but yet I hadn't come across it before. I guess I hadn't been paying attention, but yeah, and when you do that, when you go through Family Search and you um just explore, be sure to make notes and write this down because it's so easy to go through a rabbit hole and you may not remember where you found this or that.
Absolutely.
But wow. Oh my gosh. I love this idea of spinster clubs. I love that. It's like, no, we're single and we're proud of it and we're not lazy, we're doing something. Join our
Yeah.
club. I just love it. And mother's pensions. I had not heard that before. That is just so amazing. I've definitely put that down with a bunch of arrows next to it. I'm gonna go look through that extensively. Every patron I've had is like, oh, I missed a spot.
Well, and you know what? It helps to read. There's a Linda Gordon book that actually talks about mothers' pensions that you might
Mhm.
be interested in. So sometimes, I mean, you have to also read history. And we're in Women's History Month, and so it's a good time
Mhm.
to start reading either women historians like Linda Gordon, but also just women's history to get an idea for some of those records.
Exactly. So if you're doing genealogy, you have to become a historian, whether you like it or not. It's just, it's part of family history. And
Yep.
exactly. Wow. And then also, as you mentioned, the way history changes, what's going on at the time shapes your life and your family's life and what they can and cannot do. So, yeah, you have to take that into account and read about history. And Gina has a list of recommended books on her
Hmm.
handout. I have included the link on YouTube and Facebook. I recommend that you check it out. I know I'm going to be checking if we don't have any of these books in our collection. I'm going to be adding them to our collection. So, with that, does anyone have any questions? Anyone want to make any questions in the chat? Now's the time. Hmm. No, no, don't be shy. I know there's four of you watching. Come on, don't be shy. Hmm. Hmm. Well, in case you do have a question later, please give us a call or email, and we will definitely forward those questions on to Gina. And we are definitely going to be having Gina on again. Gina has a range of classes that she can offer that can go with several theme months. Definitely that food culture one is very interesting. Definitely want to
Hmm.
have you back for that one. Thank you for the shout out to the newspapers. I think they are definitely
Yes.
underused. Underused. I think people are used to the way newspapers are now, and back then they were used for many other things. Just that advertisements alone. Well, I mean, But that would be a great way to do it. I mean, we're kind of doing it now on Facebook. Have you seen this person? You know, it's a great way to get information. I do have one comment by MK Clark. She says, great presentation. Thank you. I'm putting that up. Greatly appreciate that.
Thank you.
MK, greatly appreciate that. And if we don't have any questions or more shout outs to Gina, the great Gina, who has books that are on order and going to be placed in our collection. And if any librarians are watching this, if you don't have her books on your collection, go to Amazon and add them to your collection list right now.
Thank you.
You need to write more. I know
Yeah,
you're very
that's
busy, but you need to
there.
write
There you
more,
go.
Gina. Food culture, that's a
Definitely.
definitely underutilized area.
Yeah,
And this with relationships, this is a whole book right here,
it
because
is.
yeah, everything you said, I feel like there is just so much more that you can say and so many more examples you can give. Do you want to add anything about these thoughts, my observations?
I think the only, kind of in closing to say is, if you've been doing genealogy for a long time, kind of get outside of your comfort zone, whether that's really going into ancestry and looking in the card catalog, looking at Family Search's card catalog, or going to an archive, because you're bound to find things that you didn't know existed.
Yeah, exactly. And also, when you do that, make notes because it's very easy to go in that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
So, um, last chance. Any questions? No? Okay, well, go ahead and contact us, Rawlings Library, Local History and Genealogy Department, if you have any questions or if you have any requests for classes that you would like to see on certain topics within genealogy. We'll do our best to accommodate you. And any final thoughts, Gina, that you'd like to share? I know you said so much and you covered so
Yeah.
much, but do you have any final thoughts?
No, just go out there and do it. Start researching.
Yeah, go out there and do it, like she said, and get out of your comfort zone.
Yep.
And my recommendation, write notes as you do that. Okay. Well, thank you so much,
All
everyone. Thank you so
right.
much, MK, for your comment. Greatly appreciate it. And have a lovely Saturday, everyone. Bye.
Bye.